William Henry Cavendish Bentinck, better known as the 3rd Duke of Portland. Not a name you'd be likely to forget, especially when you realise he was twice Prime Minister, first in 1783 and then between 1807 and 1809. But he's one of those men whose name and whose deeds has just been lost to time, just been forgotten. That means something else as well. It makes him one of history's forgotten douche canoes.
This is Past Force.
Actually, he was PM in name only, at least in his 1783 government. His 1807 to 1809 government, yes, he was de facto, de jure Prime Minister. But in 1783, no, that was basically in name only. The real heads of that government were Charles James Fox, Pitt the Younger's great rival, and Lord North, the man who, it's been said, lost the American colonies. It was a government that, given that Lord North was one of the men in charge, unsurprisingly, didn't last long. And it was one of the most bollocksless governments that there has ever been. The previous government, under the Earl of Shelburne, didn't last long, only 8 months, only 3 of which Parliament was sitting. Shelburne, one of the great would-be reformers, religious tolerance was one of his aims, negotiated peace with young America, brought down by this coalition between Fox and Lord North, a man who hated being Prime Minister and who would frequently fall asleep during speeches in Parliament, commonly regarded as one of the worst Prime Ministers there has ever been, until 2019 that is. So George III, what does he think of this? Shelburne brought down. Is he happy that this Fox-North coalition led by Portland is now in power? This government, headed by Fox and my old childhood friend Lord North, is illegitimate. It has been foisted upon me, and I will destroy them at the first available opportunity. The Lord is my shepherd and I am his sheep. Meh, 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 meh. Old George, he gets his wish soon enough. He schemes with Pitt the Younger to take over the government, and then the coalition attempts to introduce a bill to nationalise the British East India Company. A bill which George III is vehemently opposed to. So opposed, in fact, that he threatens every single member of the House of Lords. Every member of the House of Lords who votes for this bill shall be my enemy, just like the sea is my enemy. Rosie and Jim, Rosie and Jim, shouting along on the old ragdoll. And so ended Portland's not really first time as Prime Minister. The ministry, the government, didn't really achieve anything. There was no time. The only thing they really did was sign the Treaty of Paris to end the American War of Independence. But even that had all been set up by Shelburne. So they did nothing in the end. But who was he? This Duke of Portland. Despite being an 18th century politician, the Duke of Portland is not one of the most evil men in history. He doesn't make it even anywhere close to the top 10. But just because he wasn't explicitly evil doesn't mean he wasn't a complete and utter douche canoe. Georgian politics was full of nepotism. Portland's father-in-law, the Duke of Newcastle, was Prime Minister. His uncle-in-law was his Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1783. But Pitt the Younger was far worse for nepotism than Portland was, so we can't get him there. But what about that double Cavendish in his name? William Henry Cavendish Bentinck. He added one of those himself. And then he married a Cavendish. And his mother was also a Cavendish. You really wanted to be a Cavendish, didn't you? The Cavendishes, of course, one of the big aristocratic families of, well, Georgian England. They owned Chatsworth in Derbyshire. Big, grand, elaborate, stately home. And this is despite the fact that he was already aristocracy, that he was already a duke. And it's that fact, the fact that he was a duke and Fox wasn't, even though Fox was, again, part of the elite, it was that fact which meant that he was the one who got named as Prime Minister in this coalition. So it's basically a top-tier, elitist, aristocratic government. Which, again, not unusual for Georgian England. Doesn't single him out for being a douche canoe. I should point out here that he had a particular aversion to public speaking. Like you what, mate? Aversion to public speaking? You're in the wrong job, mate. Politics? It's all public speaking, isn't it? Well, Georgian England again. Politics, it's not about public service, it's not about duty. It's about privilege and power and wealth and part of being the elite. He was only in politics because he was a duke, and that's what the elite did. Typical Georgian establishment, in other words. And that's all we've seen of him so far. Typical establishment douchebag. Nothing to mark him out as one of the great douche canoes of history. So why are we here if he's just your average Georgian establishment douchebag? Well, he was a little more douchey than most. Let's put it that way. He wasn't one of the great douche canoes of history. No, by no means, but he was one of the great douche canoes of the Georgian era? Definitely. Because he defended aristocratic privilege in all its forms. He opposed reform at a time when reform was desperately needed. He supported slavery. He owned shares in slave trading companies, in possibly some plantations. He authorised the use of military force on civilians, and there was some alleged dodgy dealing going on in Ireland with the 1801 Act of Union. In general, he was not a nice man, not in any shape, way, or form. He's not a man who you'd invite to dinner. And, you know, if you ask me, he wouldn't be out of place, even though he was a Whig back in Georgian times. He wouldn't be out of place in the modern Conservative Party.
History! It's a thing of the past!
It's a thing of the past.